This is LBC, leading Britain's conversation. The Business and Economy Debate, hosted by Ian Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. I'm Ian Dale. Welcome to the Business and Economy Debate here on LBC. In the next 60 minutes, it's your chance to question four of Britain's leading politicians on the business issues that will decide the general election. Vince Cable is Liberal Democrats Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills. For the Conservatives, it's Minister of State for Business and Enterprise Matthew Hancock. Representing UKIP Deputy Chairman and former Department for Trade and Industry Minister Neil Hamilton. And for Labour, it's their Shadow Business Secretary, Chuka Amuna. Well, welcome to you all. Now, the rules are straightforward. We'll be taking questions from you, the LBC audience. The number you need is 0345 6060973. You can text your question to on 84850. None of our politicians have the slightest clue of what they're going to be asked. Our panel will also get the chance to quiz each other. As well as listening, you can also watch us live on lbc.co.uk from our studios here in Leicester Square. And you can take part using the hashtag LBC debate. So let's get on with it. The first question comes from Mike, who's in Berlin, believe it or not. Mike, what would you like to ask?
Good evening. I'd like to ask the panel, what will be the impact of leaving the EU on businesses in Britain?
Matthew Hancock.
Well, I think that we do a huge amount of trade with the EU, but the truth is that for the first time in my lifetime, last year, there was more trade with countries outside the EU. So we need to trade with the whole world. Our plan is to have a reform of Europe, not only to benefit the UK, but also to benefit all countries in Europe. You know, there's some southern European countries that really need those sorts of reforms too. And then settle the issue in a referendum. You know, there hasn't been a vote, there hasn't been a referendum in my lifetime, and I think it's about time that people had their say.
But wouldn't that create a lot of uncertainty in the business community? I mean, effectively for 2 years.
Well, we hear this argument, but actually since the policy of a referendum was announced about 2 years ago, investment into the UK has increased. Business investment has gone up by about 7%. We've had more investment here than the rest of the EU put together. So the facts don't stack up that argument. And there's a broader point. Should we reform Europe? Yes, I think everybody would agree with that. But you can't get that reform unless you're also willing to then settle the issue. And frankly, people have not had a referendum on the EU at all, and they haven't had a referendum on our relationship with Europe in almost 40 years.
OK, Chuka Amuna, it's a fair point, isn't it? There hasn't been a referendum in your lifetime.
There hasn't been a referendum in my lifetime, but let me just answer the question, which was what would be the impact of leaving the EU on Britain and its businesses? Well, the first thing is we've got a trade deficit. We import more than we export. This is our fourth decade of a trade deficit, and we need to sell more into the world. We get the benefit of being part of our nearest and biggest export market by being a member of the EU, but also we get trade agreements through that unlock emerging markets that we can get into too. That's the first thing. Secondly, we would have to comply with almost all the regulations that you have coming out of the European Union anyway, whether we were in or out. Norway has to, but Norway, which isn't a member of the European Union, has no say over those regulations. I'd much rather we stayed in the European Union with our bat on the field, getting the best deal for British businesses. And finally, we already know from many of the biggest employers and many multinational corporations that choose to situate the European headquarters in the UK that they will think twice about making those investment decisions if we're outside the EU. HSBC has recently given an indication to that effect. Nissan, which is one of the most successful car makers, has done that too.
But we were told this in 1999 when it was thought that we should go into the euro by some people. If we didn't do that, we would lose out on all the inward investment and all the rest of it. But
Ian, whether or not you join the euro or not is a very different question from whether or not you remain a member of the European Union. And by the way, OK, you would expect it because we're in a business and economy debate. But I also think when we see growing jihadism in Africa, the rise of IS in the Middle East, who knows what President Putin's intentions are in Russia, there's also big geopolitical reasons for us to remain a member, because these are nations which have similar values to us, and actually working with them, we can actually provide leadership within the EU, but also ensure that we continue to do what we've always done, which is punch above our weight on the world stage.
Vince Cable, it used to be your party's policy to have an EU referendum, an in-out referendum. And what do you say to Mike in Berlin?
Well, we're not opposed to a referendum, and indeed we supported the principle of a referendum in this Parliament, and Parliament's already agreed the conditions under which it could happen if there were a change in the treaty arrangements. But what we would be worried about is simply embarking now on an exercise to reopen British membership under current conditions. And you use the key word, which is uncertainty. You've got a couple of years while these agreements are renegotiated, and we don't know what would happen. Mr Cameron might get better terms, he may not, and we don't know how the other countries would respond. And there would be enormous uncertainty about our manufacturers who are committed to the single market in Europe, and indeed the financial services industry and others. And then, of course, supposing the vote happens to be very close, you get a Scottish problem where the people who lose don't accept the result. And if possible, that we could vote to leave. People could be fed up with the government at the time. And then you've got a massive period of uncertainty trying to negotiate another arrangement. Now, I've spent my 5 years as Secretary of State with my Conservative colleagues, going around the world promoting trade with China, India, Russia, Korea, Turkey. We can do that as members of the European Union, and we're constantly in the process of negotiating better deals with those countries. We need secure, stable relationship in the European single market combined with an outward-looking approach to the emerging markets.
Now, is a European referendum a red line for you in terms of coalition negotiations?
It's a fundamentally important issue, but I'm not publicly negotiating a coalition. We don't know
Everybody else seems to.
Well, I'm not. There are certain issues that are very, very important to us, and that's one of them, but I'm not in the process.
But I mean, Nick Clegg has said it isn't a red line for the Liberal Democrats, but I suspect that might be different for other members of your party.
No, I don't think there's a difference of view. I mean, he agrees with me. Indeed, we've both been on the same platform over the last 5 years warning about the dangers for Britain if we get into spending the next 5 years, or 2 or 3 years even, debate looking at our navals, deciding what is our relationship with the rest of Europe. It completely gets in the way of economic recovery.
So you sound to me as if you don't think it should be a red line.
No, I'm not defining red lines. I mean, that's
Nick Clegg hasn't he?
He's been setting out a series of issues which he thinks are important in any negotiation, and this is also very, very important in the negotiations. I found it difficult to see that we could operate in a government which regarded this as the central issue of the day and wanted to reopen all our relationships with Europe.
OK. Neil Hamilton, 3 million jobs at risk, according to Nick Clegg, if we leave the EU. You've been a business minister. You know the uncertainty that 2 years of a referendum campaign that would have on business.
Well, there are about 3 million jobs that depend upon trading with the EU, but nobody in his right mind thinks we're going to stop trading with the EU if we leave it. We don't have to be the 51st state of the United States of America in order to trade with America. And as we have, as Chucker pointed out, a vast trade deficit. The last quarter alone, it was £22 billion with the EU. They're not going to want to cut off their noses to spite their face, are they, and stop trading with us. I can't think that the chairman of Mercedes or BMW or Audi are going to refuse to sell us their cars. Of course they'll want to trade with us. 90% of British business does no trade with Europe, and yet they're tied up in all the entanglement of European red tape, etc. There's a massive deadweight cost because of the crazy energy policies of the European Union, vastly adding to household bills and businesses' bills. And we have access to the whole world outside the EU as well, because the EU is a declining force in the world through the madness of the euro policy, which is impoverishing the whole of Europe.
But the point is nobody is necessarily suggesting they're going to cease all trade with us altogether. But of course, the tariff barriers and levies go up, and of course, hang on just a moment. The other issue is, what they're just going to allow us to have all the benefits that we have now once we leave. Does anybody seriously believe that? And of course, the other thing is, I mean, Vince was talking about China, for example. If you go over and speak to the government in China, as I have done, they do not understand why the hell we would want to leave the European Union. Because we sit at the moment, when we're negotiating with them, trade agreements, etc., we sit on one side of the table with 500 million other people.
We don't negotiate a trade agreement with China. That's an EU competence.
But that's the point.
We're negotiating it with our European partners.
Hang on a second. That is an important point, because if the Chinese don't understand why we would want to leave, how can you persuade them that it would be in our interest to do so?
Well, they don't want to be a member of the EU. And the difference between trade and political union.
But also, Neil, what about these big global multinational companies which are looking where to situate the European headquarters? Do you seriously think they're going to do that
in
the UK?
Business you've been a practical businessman like I have, having to turn
Let's
a
not
profit
talk about
in
the
at
business
end
you've
of
engaged
the-
in, Neil.
Well, we can talk about my businesses because I'm in recruitment for one to start with,
God help us.
in the jobs business. But businesses will move to where the business environment is most friendly. HSBC would move their international headquarters. I think it's very unlikely they would move it to France or Germany. They'd move it to Hong Kong or Singapore.
They
outside
just
the EU.
Make it clear.
But I say,
Very quickly, Matthew, then Vince.
let the people decide. And we've heard just now, Labour don't want to give people a say. We know that UKIP and the Lib Dems can't deliver on that, and Lib Dems it seem to be clear that they probably don't want a referendum. UKIP can't deliver on that. So if you do want that referendum, and you, like me, haven't had one in your lifetime, or you'd like a vote now, there's only one way to get that, and that's to vote Conservative on Thursday.
We've heard that line a few times. in
and
this
you'll hear it
campaign.
again.
Vince Cable.
Well, you raised a very specific issue, which I thought was quite important one, which is about the banks.
Yes.
Right? These, the banks have done enormous damage to the UK economy, but they're now back on track. Here you have one of the largest banks in the world, which is now questioning its position in the UK for a complicated set of reasons. But one of the most important is that at the moment they have a understanding about the rules of the financial single market of which they're part. Any major uncertainty about that is one of the significant factors that may persuade them to walk and go somewhere else and take their jobs with them.
Right, let's take a break from questions for... actually, let me quickly go back to Mike in Berlin, just to get his perspective on what he's heard. Mike, who do you sympathise with most?
I have to come down with Neil Hamilton, I think, because I'm a partner in a UK business. We buy software from Germany, we sell it in the UK. I'm sure that if we left the EU, from a political standpoint, that we would still trade with Germany and other countries. It wouldn't be an issue for us. On the export side, I don't know. Maybe there would be some levies that they would apply, but we'd have to wait and see. But we certainly need to be asked. We were never asked for a political union. We were asked about an economic union, and we ended up with a political union. So I think we need to be asked if we still want to be part of that.
OK, Mike, thank you very much. If you're listening, you might want to watch us as well at lbc.co.uk. Let's go to the first of our Ask Me Anything segments. This is where one candidate has questions posed to them by each of the other three. There are 4 of these dotted throughout tonight's debate, each lasting 5 minutes. Now, the order has been drawn by lots, and the first to be questioned is Matt Hancock. And Vince Cable, you're going to ask the first question.
Well, Matt, we've worked together in the Department of Business very well, but there is the possibility if your guys were to push for where would you cut that?
Well, I don't accept the premise of the question, because those numbers assume that we won't be able to make the savings that we want to and that we need to by reforming the welfare budget. And so we've set out how we're going to make savings in welfare. Now, the Lib Dems the Lib Dems have been very clear that they don't want to see as big savings in welfare. I think that it's important to make those savings in welfare in order to be able to principle of it, can we make savings in the next Parliament? This deliver that
Goes in the next Parliament.
No, that's not what I was saying. I was saying that I don't recognise the 20% figure because it assumes that we won't take any other action.
What's the Treasury's estimate of what would be required?
No, it's not the Treasury's estimate.
What figure is the Treasury's estimate then?
What we've said is that we'll make savings for 2 years at the same pace as we've made savings over these last 5 years. And for several of those years, Vince and I have worked together to make those savings and also to drive up the effectiveness of the services that the department operates and cut down on admin costs. We've cut down significantly on admin costs.
Already,
That's right, and I'm sure that we can make further savings in that sort of area.
Chukwuemeka.
Matt, I think business wants a more sane and rational debate around immigration. I'd like to see one in our country as a whole. And with that in mind, do you regret your government's decision to commission those disgusting go-home vans which were sent around London boroughs similar to mine with high levels of immigration, or with a lot of people like myself from an immigrant background?
No, I don't, because I think that it's important that we get a grip on immigration and have an immigration policy everybody can know is credible and serious. And frankly, the immigration system that was left behind in 2010 was as bad as the fiscal situation, which, as we all know from that note that Liam Byrne left, was an absolute disaster and there was no money left. Similarly in immigration, we've had to take tough steps over these 5 years in order to try to get a system in place, you know, for instance, bringing in the exit checks, but also making sure that when people ought to leave, they do leave. And lots of different things were tried, and some of them worked, and it's all about getting a grip.
So why with those vans, which frankly would have done the BNP proud, why were they decommissioned if there wasn't a regret that they'd been commissioned in the first place?
Well, I think it was pretty clear after they were first used that it was not the best, not the best way to do it. But you've got to
clearly.
Well, what happened is that we inherited an immigration system that was in a total mess, including the inability to remove people who may have been here legally or illegally.
You don't feel able to say that you feel with hindsight that was a bad decision.
I'll throw it back to you then, Chuck. Do you in hindsight regret?
Those vans were disgusting.
Do you in hindsight regret the fact that Labour left in 2010 an immigration system that was out of control? That is the problem we were facing.
He'll have his questions in a bit if you want to ask him. Just briefly with you, Vince Cable, though, Lynn Featherstone said this week that if she'd been still at the Home Office at that point, she would have vetoed these vans. Why didn't Jeremy Brown do that?
We should have vetoed them, and he made it very clear that they were unacceptable. Indeed, I mean, Lynn is furious that I think she's been blamed in some Labour literature for having approved these vans and was nowhere near the department at the time. But no, they were a disgrace and should never have happened.
Neil Hamilton, your question to Matt Hancock.
Well, Matt, I'd like to ask a question about aid. Most of our aid budget doesn't go on disaster relief or humanitarian projects, such as the terrible situation in Nepal at the minute. And yet the government has given a legal commitment to spend 0.7% of GDP on foreign aid. But it won't give a similar commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defence. So how can you defend that difference?
Well, I think it's very clear. I mean, on aid, the ability for us as a nation to support other countries around the world, in particular having stronger governance, to make sure they have a stronger legal system, framework of law, of course, to also support people whether in Nepal or to tackle Ebola. We were able to be one of the leading nations alongside the States tackling Ebola because of our using our aid budget. That stops countries, can help to stop countries disintegrating and therefore posing a direct security risk here in the UK. There is a direct security link from our aid budget through to stopping people coming and committing acts potentially of terror here in the UK. And, defence in the modern world involves intelligence, it involves parts of the aid budget, it also involves more conventional forces. And we've got to be intelligent about how we use defence. For instance, the intelligence budget has gone up significantly. But it isn't technically counted within that defence number. And so you've got to be smart about it in the modern world.
But a lot of this money is being spent on wasted projects and is going to some of the most corrupt countries on earth. The idea that giving £200 million a year to Somalia is in any way going to produce good governance in Somalia is just ridiculous. Shouldn't we put our own people first and spend our money on our own defence
20 seconds.
rather than foreign aid?
We tackled a huge amount in terms of where the aid goes. For instance, reducing aid to the countries that are growing fast and now getting more prosperous. But Somalia is a good example of a country with a very poor system of governance and a direct link to, for instance, the terrorism off the Horn of Africa. We need to tackle that, and the best way to tackle that is to support those countries to be stronger themselves.
Right, let's move on to another question from Elizabeth, who's in Golders Green. Elizabeth, what's your question, please?
Well, good evening, Ian. Good evening, gentlemen. I would like Mr. Cable and Mr. Amuna to justify this ridiculous mansion tax and what will happen when people can't pay it.
Well, it was Vince Cable's idea, I think, originally. We'll come to him in a second, but Shukra Amuna.
Well, we live in fiscally straitened times. There's not a huge amount of money around. And therefore, we need to work out how we're going to fund things like our National Health Service, which is currently experiencing a crisis. We've seen in the last 12 months over 1 million people waiting more than 4 hours to be treated. Well, hang on, you asked the question, Elizabeth, do let me answer it. And so you have to raise the monies in some way. Now, I've looked, in respect of the area I've had the privilege of representing, at how many houses would fall within the 2 million, how many houses are currently on sale for over £2 million. And out of almost 800 properties, there are just 2 that are currently would be affected that are on sale. And so that's what we're seeking to do. You raise the money to fund your public services, and I think it is fair to ask those who are doing a bit better, who are a bit better off. It's fair to ask them to pay. Which you might be wondering, Elizabeth, if you're, say, asset rich but income poor, the way our mansion tax would operate is in such a way that that wouldn't hit you.
Vince Cable, this was your idea originally, but your party seems to have backed away from it.
No,
somewhat.
the basic principle is that we have a system of property taxation already, and it's called council tax. It was introduced 25 years ago, and property prices were very different. And broadly speaking, you progress from Band A to Band H, whatever, depending roughly in proportion to the value of the property. Once you get to the top of the scale, you pay no more. And so you have an absurd situation where people in kind of suburban semis are actually paying more council tax than people in 50, 100 million pound pads in the middle of London. I mean, the whole system has become highly inequitable. So essentially what we're recommending is that you build on the principle of property tax that we have in the council tax system. You add a series of bands for very high value
And what's
property.
wrong with that, Chuka Amuna?
Well, the problem with the system that's been proposed by the Lib Dems is it will require a whole new load of valuations, whereas with the system that we would introduce, it wouldn't require that. Can I just make 2 other points, actually?
So you wouldn't value the houses?
In terms of the way in which the threshold
How
would...
can you tax something that you don't value, honestly?
Well...
that is the economic illiteracy of the Labour Party all over. They want to tax something without valuing it.
Hang on just a minute before you carry on with your garbage. You've introduced as a government a system actually where you can work off the valuations you currently have to look at the properties which would be worth £2 million or more.
Which are based in 1991, aren't they? Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a whole other issue which maybe Matt wants to talk to. But let me just...
I don't need to, because I'm not proposing to tax people on their family home.
Just let me...
But we already do, Matt. We have the council tax.
If I could just finish... Take control, Ian. If I might actually just finish my sentence, which was that in terms of the threshold that would apply, the £2 million threshold, that would rise, by the way, in line with the average increase in property prices of properties over £2 million. What you're looking at for somebody who has a property falling between £2 and £3 million is a £250 a month levy. And if you are not in the 40% tax bracket, then you will be able to elect to pay the levy on the point that it's transferred, the property is transferred, and that way we avoid somebody who's asset rich.
Elizabeth,
and
I can hear you gagging to respond.
Elizabeth obviously doesn't like the policy.
What would you like to say?
Well, it just hear them all squabbling. I mean, it's ridiculous tax. As I say, if you haven't got the money to pay for it, you'll have to wait till you die. So the money from the NHS won't come into play, maybe, hopefully, for years for these people that have these properties. And as I said, they haven't answered the question. What happens if you haven't got the money to pay for it?
Right, Chuck, I'm going to...
How can you assume that house properties aren't going to go down like the oil prices did in Scotland?
Right, quick answer, Chuka.
The quick answer is you won't have to pay it if you don't, to answer the question directly, if you aren't in the higher tax band. You won't have to pay it because obviously it won't kick in until the property transfers. And secondly, in terms of the monies raised, you wouldn't have to wait until it transfers because we believe that there are a substantial number of people who will be paying it who will be able to afford to pay it, and therefore it will raise money. And actually, I think Danny Alexander, who looked at the Lib Dems version of this, reckoned that it would be able to raise at least £1.5 billion. And that was based on Treasury statistics.
I'm going to kind of assume, unless you correct me, that Neil and Matt are against this policy. So we'll move on, if that's okay with the both of you.
Well, I would just like to say...
I wish we could move on and it didn't have to be levied.
No, I'm going to move on to Ahmed, who's at Heathrow. Ahmed, what would you like to ask?
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
I've got a question. And the question is, what are the benefits of immigration to business, the economy, and the country?
Neil Hamilton.
Well, obviously, where there are skills gaps, we need immigration to fill them. And the UKIP's policy is not to be against all immigration, but to be in favour of controlled immigration, so that we don't have hundreds of thousands of people coming to this country every year without any skills, who are depressing wages at the bottom of the income scale and being a burden upon public services. The population has expanded by a huge amount in the last 10 years because of opening the borders to Eastern Europe. We added to our population last year 300,000 people. They all need to be housed. They all have to travel to and from work. A lot of them use the health service. A lot of them use the schools. We haven't got the public sector infrastructure to cope with the scale of the problem. So, of course, for particular businesses, immigration can be a benefit. But at the present rate and flow of immigration, it's undoubtedly a massive problem for the UK.
Chukwuemeka, you've accused UKIP in the past of being racist. What's racist about their immigration policy?
Well, let me answer Ahmed's question first, and then let me address the stance that's been taken by UKIP, not just during this general election, but for the last few years. Look, I think immigration has massively culturally enriched our nation. No surprise, I'm the son of an immigrant that I'm saying that. I also think it provides, in terms of the immigrants we have, not just recent ones, but second and third generations, provide through the different diaspora fantastic links to precisely the emerging market economies in Africa and India that we want to export more to. Neil is right. We also do need people who have got the skills until we actually do what we must do, which is train up many of our own people so that they've got the technical and vocational skills that employers are saying lacking. This idea, by the way...
Isn't he also right that we're taking too many unskilled people in, particularly from Eastern Europe? That is what UKIP is saying.
Well, we need to ensure that our people have the skills. But in terms of the overall rhetoric that comes from UKIP, frankly, most things that are wrong with the country tend to be blamed on immigrants. They have adopted, you asked the point, why do I... Well, let me just finish. You adopt the slogan of the BNP last spring, Love Britain. Your leader gets stuck in a traffic jam.
Your leader gets stuck in British jobs for British workers. What's the difference?
Your leader gets stuck in a traffic jam and blames it on immigration. We have seen a stream of invective and numerous people who are not only elected representatives of holding public office, but also standing for public office, who have come out with a stream of racist invective. That is why I think they have got a problem with that. And as for somehow all of our problems in our public services being down to immigrants, I have
Nobody
actually,
said
Neil,
that. I certainly
you
haven't.
just were talking about the burden that immigrants place on our public services. Take the biggest public service of all, the NHS. The NHS would not be able to do what it does right now were it not for the immigrants working in it.
The whole point of UKIP's points-based immigration policy is that we take the people that we want and we can refuse entry to those that we don't want. And most of the British people agree with this policy.
Now, don't forget, you can watch us live at lbc.co.uk. Matt Hancock, how would you like to answer this question?
Well, I think that throughout our history as a nation, immigration has brought great benefits. And if you look at the entrepreneurial nature of people who've arrived from overseas, they tend to be more likely to be entrepreneurs, more likely to set up a business. I think that immigration has brought many, many benefits, but it is about control and it's about scale.
And your government's failed to control immigration, hasn't it?
We've been very clear about the goal, wanting to bring down immigration to the tens of thousands.
No ifs, no buts. That was the promise from the Prime Minister at the last election.
And ultimately, if you want to control immigration, you need to reform our relationship with Europe. So it comes back to the first question.
But Mr Juncker said only last week that there was no prospect of changing the rules on free movement of labour within the EU.
What we want to do is make sure that people don't come here to claim benefits and to use our public services without having paid in for a substantial period of time. Now, I remember being told when we proposed that nobody should be able to claim unemployment benefits for 3 months unless they'd worked for 3 months. Because it's a contributory principle, we were told nobody would sign up to this. And within a year, we had the whole of the rest of the EU sign up to this proposal. Now, we're saying very clearly that you have to be a resident for 4 years before you get the full access to the NHS access to unemployment
Fine,
benefits
but
and other
but
things.
this is
and
not
I think,
relevant.
and of course it's relevant because it's about who
But
comes.
to address the
people-
point
because
about,
when
about
people come
Jean-Claude Juncker,
People don't
he's
come
not
here
going
for
to give
benefits.
you...
They come here to work.
He's not going to
improve their lives.
allow Britain to effectively rewrite the whole Treaty of Rome about free movement of labour. You don't seriously think the Prime Minister can negotiate that, do you?
Yeah, watch us get this through because everybody said that David Cameron would not be able to cut the EU budget.
Is that a
and
pig
he
I see
cut
flying
it.
outside the
But
window?
hold on. Everybody said the Prime Minister would never veto a treaty, and in fact, the reason that he had to veto the treaty was because the Europeans didn't believe it,
wasn't
because
a
Tony
But-
Blair had so
but-
frequently said,
okay.
I will,
Vince-
this is my red line, and then he crossed it.
Vince-
we set a red line, and we stuck to it.
Vince
and
Cable,
so
the question,
absolutely
let's
we can
just
get it
remind
through.
ourselves of the question. What are the benefits of immigration to business and the economy?
Several. Specific skills coming in from overseas. Disproportionate number of dynamic firms are immigrant populated, and overseas students who bring in about 9 billion to the economy every year. They study here, they go home. They're classified for rather bizarre reasons as immigrants, but actually they're temporary and they make great value to the economy. And overall, if we look at, for example, the movements within the European Union, a lot of studies have been undertaken of the benefits of UK. Because they're relatively young, they pay in tax far more than they take out in costs and health and so on. So they're very substantial benefits.
Do you agree with Chuka Umunna about UKIP's immigration policy being essentially racist?
I don't like to use words like... I mean, there are probably individual members of UKIP who have those prejudices and they surface from time to time, but I'd rather not use that language.
Okay.
I would simply say it's wrong-headed rather than racist.
And do you think your coalition colleagues, the Conservatives, have indulged in dog whistle politics on this at all, but by promoting a policy that they must have known in 2010 that they couldn't possibly...
Well, I mean, this is
achieve?
an ongoing tension within the coalition, and we've had this argument across our ministers that the net immigration target that they set was never going to be deliverable. I mean, quite apart from it being delivered, it couldn't be delivered because there are so many things that are beyond our control. We can't control the number of British people who leave. We have free movement within the European Union. There are a lot of British expatriates who come home. These are things that, you know, unless you go back to the Soviet Union and controlling the borders in and out, there's no way you can manage net immigration.
I just want to be clear. I'm not saying that there is anything racist in wanting properly controlled immigration. But what I am saying is that I do believe, if you look at the behaviour and the comments that have come out of UKIP, that they have a problem with race. There's no doubt about that.
Don't forget, you can watch us at lbc.co.uk. I think it's been quite entertaining so far, judging from some of the feedback I'm seeing online. Chuka Umunna, it's your chance now to answer questions from the rest of the panel. Vince Cable, you have the first question.
Well, Chuka, your party, like mine, has made promises on university tuition fees and had to go back on them, to our mutual embarrassment, the Tories too in their turn.
Good of you to bring it up.
Now that you are promising to cut them, and that the funds that were going to be used to cut them in terms of pension pots have been removed, how are you going to finance universities and simultaneously cut tuition fees?
We've been absolutely clear that this is fully funded. The overwhelming majority of the monies for this comes from the change in the treatment of the pension tax pounds or more. And let's be absolutely clear that the current system that you introduced, Vince, is totally not only because it dumps a lorry load of debt on students who on average as undergraduates will graduate with £44,000 worth of debt, but because at the end of 30 years, having had all that debt, many won't be able to pay it off. The current projections, and these based on House of Commons Library figures, are that that's going to result in an extra £281 billion worth of debt for the government by 2030. That is not a sustainable situation. And if anybody is going to be worried about these things and whether it's fully funded, it's the university vice-chancellors. If you look at what many vice-chancellors have said, also other organisations like Million Plus, they are more than satisfied that we've illustrated that we will fully fund this pledge.
But would you not accept that the system of repayment which we brought in, which is related to people's ability to pay, and you don't pay anything till 21,000, is progressive, and that by cutting it in the way you're proposing, the income group that benefits most are future graduates with incomes of 80,000? What is progressive about that?
I don't accept the system that we're going to introduce is regressive. And also, I think you completely ignore the fact that people are going to be carrying inexcusable levels of debt as a result of what you've been doing.
Matt Hancock.
Chuka, Do you deny that the previous Labour government spent too much when in office?
Yes, I do, and I'll tell you why. Because if we didn't,
Not again.
If we did, well, let's look.
Do you think anybody agrees with?
Well, if you asked the question, why didn't you wait for the answer before jumping in to try?
I got an answer.
yourself?
It was very short and it was completely wrong.
But I hadn't actually finished giving it, and so put aside the arrogance and let me put aside the arrogance and let me answer the question. When we got into office, we inherited a debt to GDP ratio of 40%. We reduced that to 37% in 2007. In terms of the deficit, the average deficit under the 18 years of Tory government that we had before we were elected was 3.2%. Before the crash hit, it was 1.3%. So if you look at the historics of the figures going into the crash, they were not at all unusual. Actually, they were pretty good. What happened after the recession, precipitated by a banking crisis, which was global, was the debt. I'll come to that in a moment. Well, you put in place a few of them, but I'll come to that in a minute. But
you changed the system completely under Gordon Brown.
But the point is, the banking system precipitated the crash, which led to a fall in corporation tax receipts, income tax receipts, and all the rest, and that is what led to the deficit. Now, should we?
Just not true, though. The OECD disagree with you. Everybody.
If I'm wrong, why did you sign up to the same spending plans of the Labour government in 2007? If I'm wrong, you signed up to the same spending plans as us in 2007, and you wouldn't have done that, surely, if you thought we were borrowing too much.
Because by then the deficit was too high. And
in 2007,
yes, and
you signed up to the same spending plans.
But the key point is, we have just spent the last 5 years.
You wouldn't have signed up to the same spending plans of us in 2007 if the deficit and the debt was too high at that point. Let's be honest about that. We have just spent the last 5 years dealing with that mess, and all of the independent experts agree that the deficit was too high in 2007. That is
and
rubbish.
I think so too.
That is rubbish.
Well,
you didn't. We did not have the deficit issues because we were. A global financial crisis was not caused by a domestic Labour government.
I'm going to call you to order here because we want to hear Neil's question.
Oh, hang on. Oh, dear.
Neil's trying to use his technology here for the benefit of LBC listeners.
I was told that the question sheet was going to be here, but it isn't.
Well, I think it is on the other side of your...
Oh, is it? Oh, so it is. Well, there we are.
Turn over the page.
Right. There's one intelligent politician amongst us.
I think this happens with people who sit in that chair.
Well, my question is related to this, actually. The fact of the matter is that until 2001, you stuck to Kenneth Clarke's spending plans, and then in 2001, Labour took its foot off the brake, and by 2007 you'd racked up the national debt by 200 billion, and there was another 300 billion added by the time you left office in 2010. So the idea that Labour didn't overspend is absolute nonsense. But I want to go on to ask about your spending plans, which you've announced in the course of this election campaign, and how you're going to finance them, because it seems to me that they're predicated...
Can we have the question?
Yes.
Quickly.
They're predicated upon cracking down on tax avoidance. Why didn't you do that when you were in office for 13 years, and if it's so easy? And so how do you justify... and why would the non-DOMs whom you're going to tax stick around to be milked by a Labour government?
So I think there were probably three questions there.
Well, let's just stick to one. Let's stick to the last one.
Let me just go through. Let me try and address all three of them.
Well, no.
There are no spending.
We only have a short time, so you just address the non-dom one, if you would.
Well, I wasn't too sure exactly what your question is.
Changing the rules on domicile, right?
Yes.
So that you taxed foreigners living in this country on their overseas earnings. Why would they stick around to be taxed under a Labour government?
Well, frankly, I don't think the only reason people want to live in our country and come to it is because of the tax regime. I think they come here for many other reasons, and we're a great country. But in terms of, well, hang on just a minute. In France, what they have sought to do is to introduce a 75% top rate of tax, which I think is crazy, and we would never do. That is not what we're proposing to do here. But every single commitment in our manifesto, is properly costed and properly funded. In fact, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has been clear that of all the announcements that have been made, we are the ones who've illustrated how we're funded more than any other party.
Right, let's move on. Let's go to Nadeem, who's in Finchley. Hello, Nadeem.
Good evening to the panel.
What's your question?
Nice to see everyone getting along really well.
It's been a bit more feisty than the women leaders debate, I'll tell you. Right, what's your question?
Do you support quotas to get more women and ethnic minorities onto company boards?
Vince Cable.
No, I don't support quotas. We've had an ambitious programme over the last few years, which I've been driving in government, to raise very substantially the share of women, and we're actually very close to achieving the 25% target. I mean, obviously a lot more needs to be done. We need to go beyond that. We need to have women who are executive directors, not just non-executive directors, more chairs. But we've made a real progress, and I'm actually rather proud of the work we've done in that area. And we also need to make sure that the boards of British companies are more racially diverse as well. They're not, and there is a useful piece of work now going on with the Equalities Commission and others about that.
Neil Hamilton?
Well, UKIP is colourblind, contrary to what Chucker was saying earlier on, and I think it would be a highly retrograde step to introduce quotas on companies for who should be on their board, whether that's to do with gender or the colour of your skin or your racial background. Companies are in business to make profits out of which that we can fund public services on the taxes they pay and to create jobs for people, to give them a secure livelihood, and anything which threatens that, I think, is something which ought to be opposed.
Chucker?
First of all, I think before we start lecturing others, including companies, we should get our own house in order. I think I'm the only person of colour on this panel, but I think it's a great shame there are no women here, and that shows that we've got to sort out Parliament, which is why I'm very proud that we have had more female MPs and ethnic minority MPs than all the other parties. Myself and Sadiq Khan are two ethnic minority members of our shadow cabinet, and we should all be striving to do better. By the way, I actually think the Tories have improved this Parliament and deserve credit for that, but I think the Lib Dems and the Greens in particular have a lamentable record on these issues. I've got to say, I think Vince has done a good job in respect of women on boards.
Enough of the praise. This is supposed to be a debate.
You didn't actually. I'm going to criticise Chuka here because he attacked the Greens for not having very good diversity in Parliament, but they've only got one MP and she's a woman. So it's a bit. So I thought that was a bit harsh. So I'm sticking up for the Greens, even though there isn't a Green representative here. And he's right that we in our party make huge efforts and strides in our No, I don't think that we should move to quotas. I think that we've made an enormous amount of effort. It's been a true coalition effort to try to get more women on boards, to make sure boards are more diverse. And the reason, there's a good business reason here, which is that all of the evidence shows that boards that are more diverse perform more effectively, and both the financial data and broader reports all show that. And so giving more women the opportunity to be on boards and trying to get there without some sort of patronising quota system is absolutely the way to go. We've made loads of progress.
No, we have to move on because we're running out of time. It's Vince Cope, it's your turn in the spotlight now for your Ask Me Anything round. Chuka Amuna is going to ask the first question.
I have to say, I'm completely confused as to what Vince's position is in respect of supporting any future Conservative government in this in-out referendum in 2017. I asked you about this at the last business questions in the House of Commons, and you said you would not entertain any arrangement where you were signing up to an in-out referendum in 2017. You repeated that in the last hustings.
Can we get a question?
That Matthew and I did. So the question is, after Thursday, would you personally countenance your party going into coalition with or supporting in the House of Commons a Conservative party committed to an in-out referendum in 2017? Yes or no?
My position hasn't changed one iota from the earlier quotes you gave me. I said I think it would be a really, really bad idea to embark on a referendum campaign in the next Parliament when we want to be concentrating on
Would you go into government with the Tories?
I'm not going over the mechanics of how you negotiate with other parties after the election. The public have not yet decided.
Well, either you would support an in-out referendum in 2017 or not.
No, I don't support an in-out referendum in 2017, but the issue about who you work with and on what basis depends on the electorate.
Would you be prepared to work with people on the basis that you had to agree to a 2017 in-out referendum?
I do not agree with having a 2017.
That's not answering the question I asked.
I do not agree with it. The basis on which the next government
Could you be a member of a cabinet which was going to do this in-out referendum in 2017?
I'm not picking the next cabinet. I mean, I may or may not be in it.
Would you be in a cabinet? Would you be in a cabinet where there was a 2017 in-out referendum that you were doing as a government?
We're not negotiating here on the makeup of the next government and the next cabinet. The public will decide that on Thursday.
Is that a yes
I'm making
or no?
it absolutely clear.
Would you be a member of a cabinet
I do not support
which was going to implement an in-out referendum in 2017?
I do not
Use your seat. There's a job here for you. Neil Hamilton, your question.
Yeah, well, I'd like to ask a question which affects real people outside the Westminster bubble.
Good. Thank you.
And that's about energy prices. David Cameron's father-in-law gets £1,000 a day in subsidies for the 8 wind turbines on his country estate. We have 5 million people now living in fuel poverty, households living in fuel poverty in this country. The average electricity bill is £115 a year, more than it needs to be because of the green taxes which are added to it. How do you justify taxing the poor to line the pockets of rich landowners when Britain produces only 2% of global emissions of CO2? And if we closed the whole economy down, it wouldn't make any difference.
Well, we're doing neither of those things, but it is very important for the long term, and dealing with the issue of climate change, I don't know whether you accept that that is an issue, that we do have a diverse source of supply of energy, including renewables and including wind. Of course, onshore wind is now becoming competitive in price. I've been in the energy industry for many years, and of course one of the things you quickly learn is that prices change over time. And as we invest more in offshore wind, as we have done, and one of the things I'm proudest of having done is help set up the Green Investment Bank, the costs will fall, and equally other renewables also. So we're investing for the long term.
But because wind is intermittent, you have to have a backup supply of power generation as well, which effectively doubles the capital cost of generation. So it's not actually an economic method of generating electricity.
Well, it isn't intermittent in exactly the same way all over the UK at exactly the same time, so you don't have to double the backup. You'll have to have some backup
Let's
capacity.
move on. Matt Hancock, your question?
Vince, we've worked together for over these last 5 years. What would you have done differently to Nick Clegg if you'd been leader?
No, I've worked very happily with Nick Clegg, and I would not have done things differently.
But that's not answering my question. What would you have done differently to Nick Clegg if you'd been leader?
I honestly can't think of things that I would have done differently.
Nothing at all.
We've got 14 minutes for you to think.
You wouldn't have stabbed him in the back as Ed Miliband did to his brother.
Let's move on. Karen is in Bracknell. Hello, Karen.
Oh, good evening, Ian. Good evening, gentlemen.
Hello.
Thank you for taking my two-part question. My question is, do you believe airport expansion is necessary for business in Britain? If so, should it be Heathrow or Gatwick or Boris Island?
Good question. Matt Hancock.
Yes, we do need airport expansion, very clearly, and anybody who is involved in international business or international travel knows that. And I think in terms of location, we've got this, the review underway, and I think it's very important to listen to the outcome of that review very carefully.
That's a cop-out. It's a disgrace.
It's not a cop-out. It's an answer.
This
my
review
direct
should have
answer to the
reported
question.
before the general election, and it hasn't done. Surely you can give us your personal view as to where the new runway should be situated.
No, I want to wait for the objective review to come forward with all of the analysis and evidence in it. But there's a very important reason for this. We need to make sure that, like other big infrastructure projects, like Crossrail, like HS2, that we collect all of the information, come to a very good, sound decision, and then bind in, other political players. Because if you remember, halfway through this Parliament, I'm also a strong supporter of HS2, and the Labour Party very nearly, they wobbled, and many people in the Labour Party argued, like Ed Balls argued for it to be cancelled, and eventually we got them on side, and we've now got a broad political consensus behind HS2. To get these long-term infrastructure projects through, you need to get that political consensus.
Is Boris Island dead in the
well.
water? Because the Commission is choosing between Heathrow and Gatwick, essentially.
I look forward to reading the Commission's review.
So, okay.
I'm not going to go further than that because
right.
I think it's so important that an independent review has the space to write its conclusion.
Yes, Karen, we do need an expansion in aviation capacity. As to where, we'll wait and see what the Commission...
This is going to be a very boring round of questions if you all say, let's wait for the Commission.
I have a feeling Vince will say something different, by the way. I have a feeling Vince will say something different. But the only thing I would say, just to agree with you, Ian, we wanted the Commission to report before the general election. The only reason it was commissioned to report after the general election by the Tories was for political reasons.
Okay.
And this points to why we need an independent, a standing independent infrastructure commission to take the politics out of these things.
Neil Hamilton, can we have a more interesting answer from you, maybe?
Well, I think we're going to end this programme on a note of amity and unity, because...
we're not near the end.
I haven't asked you your question.
No, this is true. But I think it's fair enough to wait and see what Howard Davies says in his review, but UKIP wants to see Manston Airport in Kent developed, which has very good links to Ashford rail services, etc., which would be, so I believe, a good site for budget airlines and for freight.
And very close to Thanet South, of course.
And quite coincidentally, is quite close to Thanet South, although I don't know how the road system take you there.
But given the choice of Heathrow or Gatwick or Boris Island, which would you go for?
Well, I can't give a different answer from the one that Matt Hancock gave, really, because,
I thought, come on,
because
it
would be wrong to prejudice.
Straight questions, come on.
It would be wrong to prejudice the outcome of the Davis review.
I don't think you'll prejudice that by giving us a straight answer here.
I think Davis has already more or less indicated that they don't think Boris Islanders are on.
Well, they have. Vince Cable, your constituency is very near Heathrow. What's your view on this?
Well, there are pluses and minuses to my constituency. I mean, we have a lot of people who work there who use it, but equally there is massive environmental impacts. Noise is enormous, and we're talking about 1 million people across London. I mean, actually, you know, an expanding economy, of course, needs airports. We have underutilised airports like Birmingham. They're not very, very keen to expand. We've got airports in the southeast.
Yeah, but the airlines don't want to go there.
Well, that's partly because the whole system of slot allocation, and we're getting into technical stuff here, is very, very distorted. I mean, it's something that Davis acknowledged in his preliminary report.
So Heathrow or Gatwick?
Well, if that is the choice, then I think Gatwick presents far fewer problems. It affects 1/20th of the number of people. You don't have the impact of pollution and NOx to anything like the same extent. It's potentially an enormous problem with Heathrow, and it has the capacity to build up a substantial amount of staff.
You'd go for Gatwick.
As the lesser of two evils.
Well, thank goodness for a straight answer from one of you on that. Karen, I'm not sure you were particularly illuminated by that. Let's go to Neil Hamilton's Ask Me Anything. Chukramuna, what would you like to ask Neil?
Neil, you, of course, served in the government of John Major, and you're a former Conservative, and now you're UKIP. Why do you think John Major was able to win a majority, but David Cameron hasn't been able to do so?
Well, it amazed me when John Major did win a majority in 1992. So I think probably for the same reasons that David Cameron isn't going to get a majority in this election. 20 years ago, of course, things were very different. I think probably one of the main reasons why John Major won in 1992 was how poor the Labour opposition was, and some things don't change in that respect.
What lies behind your question, Chuka?
I'm just curious to know why somebody who's been around a bit and has been in both UKIP and the Tories would you know, I'm just interested to know with
Can I ask you another one? Yes. Which is, are you, like your party leader, a fan of President Putin?
I don't think that Nigel is a fan of President Putin. What he said he admired was his ability to stand up for Russia's interests. He did actually say some pretty disobliging things about President Putin.
Well, what's your view?
And President Putin has been made a far more dangerous opponent for us as a result of the EU's mad rush to get Ukraine into NATO and into the EU. No, I agree with my party leader on this. I don't agree with him on everything.
Well, that makes a change, I was going to say. Matt Hancock.
Would you agree to urge voters to vote Conservative in constituencies where only a Conservative vote can keep out Ed Miliband and the SNP?
No, I'm encouraging all
so
UKIP supporters to vote UKIP wherever there's a UKIP candidate. And I don't think that Nigel would advise UKIP supporters to do anything else. I would like to turn the question round and ask you, would you advise Conservative voters in Grimsby or Hayward and Middleton to vote UKIP because we have a better chance of defeating Labour?
Rubbish, we're only just behind in Grimsby. But the question is about making sure that this country is not brought to rack and ruin by Ed Miliband, propped up by the SNP, and you're in a position that you can urge people to do the only thing that we can be confident we'll stop that event from happening, and that's by voting Conservative.
Well, I'm encouraged to think that you feel I'm persuasive enough to carry large numbers of votes.
You're on the radio, so go for it.
Right, let's move on to an interesting text here from Pauline in Redbridge, who asks, which coalition permutation would be worst for business in Britain? Vince Cable.
Well, I think the principle of parties working together, whether it's the two we've got at the moment or conceivably indeed with the Labour Party, the idea of parties working together in the national interest is a good one, and it's good for business because it provides them with greater certainty than they would otherwise get. And that working together can be in the form of a coalition, it can be in the form of other forms of support. But the role we will play in this election is to be the party of the moderate centre.
But what would be the worst for business?
Well, I think any government that depended on extremes, whether it's the extremes of the right, nationalists, or for that matter the 40 or 50 Tory MPs who were very extreme and
so
distrust and detest Cameron.
Any coalition that doesn't involve the Liberal Democrats?
But
the parties, you know, the SNP, the Green Party, and the anti-business centre would be a huge risk to the economy.
Constructed 1980s. Clearly, it'll be disastrous for any government to be propped up by them. But that's the position in which we're going to be in as a result of the total collapse of the Labour Party in Scotland. Obviously, I'm a man of the right, just as Vince has said in the past that he's a man of the left. So, of course, I have more sympathy with Matt than I do with Chucker.
Are you still a man of the left, Vince?
I've always described myself as centre-left, broadly.
Okay.
I'm much in favour of fairness and social democratic ideas, but I'd managed to work with these guys.
Well, let's go to a man from the centre-right, Chuka Ramuna.
I was waiting for you to call me a mad lefty. Look,
I'm sure you're versatile enough if it's
No, I think we should basically let the people decide. Our job, I think, is to put the strongest foot forward, go for a majority government. That's the best way to create stability. And I think part of the reason that the momentum has been with us during this campaign, I think we've had a good campaign, is because not only have we pointed out why 5 more years of the same may not be the best thing, but actually I like to think that we've talked a lot about what we would actually do. And all you heard from Matt there, I suppose, is scaremongering and talking about what's wrong with everyone else, and he hasn't told people enough of what's right about him.
No, we haven't got time, Matt, because we're right at the end of the debate, but you've all got closing statements to make in a moment, but I'm going to bring Shakile in Shepherd's Bush into the conversation, because I think you might want to frame your remarks and pitch them directly to Shakile. What would you like to ask Shakile?
Hi.
Hello.
Okay, so there's one day left before we have to vote, and I'm still undecided. And what I want to know is, honestly, what is better? Do I vote for who's going to be good for my local area and constituency, or do I vote for who is going to be better to run the country?
Right, you've each got 45 seconds, uninterrupted this time, to answer Shakile. Matt Hancock.
Well, I think, Shakila, that you should vote Conservative, and you should vote Conservative because we have a plan for this country that is working. It's been tough these last 5 years, but we're making progress. We're creating millions of jobs, 2 million new jobs over the 5 years, more enterprise, a more entrepreneurial culture, and we've got a really positive vision of how this country can be one of the most prosperous upon earth, and I'm absolutely certain that that can benefit everybody. No, I'm absolutely certain of this as well, and that is that since I'm proposing you vote Conservative, you've also got a great local...
I don't think the two are mutually King always said, power's never given, you've got to take it. Unless you vote, you can't have an influence. You sound to me like you're one of the next generation, and we want to make sure that you can achieve your aspirations and dreams. So that's why we'll guarantee you an apprenticeship if you get the grades and you're leaving school. Or if you go to uni, we'll cut your tuition fees. And hopefully at the end of it, you can get a job. And if you can't, we'll guarantee you a job. Okay. And that's because we care about you being able to get on in life.
My party stands for fairness combined with economic competence, and we've demonstrated our commitment to both of those in government. In terms of the question, I think it is very important to focus on your local MP. We have a parliamentary system, and I would hope that's taken into account. We're not dealing with a national referendum, but the Liberal Democrats will offer moderation, competence and fairness.
Okay. Neil Hamilton?
Well, I think you should vote UKIP because we're the only party that wants to get our country back and to restore Westminster's powers to decide what goes on in this country. At the moment, so many of our laws are made for us by the European Union. We can't control our borders. We can't control our energy taxes. So many things we can't do. So if you want democracy to come back to this country, then UKIP is the only party for you.
Shakila, a quick comment from you. Have you decided who you're going to vote for?
Not quite. It helped a little, but
none of the above.
Well, all we can do is try to help. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panel, Neil Hamilton, Matt Hancock, Chuka Amuna and Vince. The business and economy debate. Whether or not you run a business, I hope we've clarified at least a few of the issues for you.